Even in the midst of a great war, armies of every nation had to deal with the problem of crime and punishment. If a soldier was judged to have committed a crime grave enough in the military service, they could face imprisonment, hard labor, even death. For a death sentence to be approved, it had to be confirmed by the commander-in-chief of the theater. Over the course of the war, over 3,000 British, Dominion, or colonial soldiers were sentenced to death, but most of those sentences were then reduced to imprisonment, field punishment, or suspended. In the end, 346 soldiers were executed by firing squad. Of those, the vast majority were in France and Belgium on the Western Front. 291 were British, 25 Canadian, 5 from New Zealand, and 4 from the British West Indian Regiment. The remaining 21 were made up of assorted soldiers and civilians who operated under military law, such as Chinese Labor Corps individuals. Australian soldiers were subject to the death penalty, but the Australian government had transferred the power to confirm the death sentence to the Governor-General of Australia, Sir Ronald Munro Ferguson, who always reduced death sentences for Australian soldiers to imprisonment. Figures regarding the crimes for which soldiers were executed can be difficult to decipher, but the vast majority of executions which took place here on the Western Front were for desertion. Once the sentence was confirmed by the commanding general, it was carried out soon after. The men were taken to a suitable location as near to their place of confinement as possible. The procedures for military executions for the British Army called for a squad of 12 men, though it was sometimes less, armed with rifles, commanded by a lieutenant. Steps were taken to avoid any undue strain on the enlisted men who made up the firing squad. So when the squad had arrived at the place of execution, their unloaded weapons were laid on the ground, and the men were led away out of sight. The officer would then load 10 of the rifles with live rounds and 2 with blanks. This allowed, at least in theory, each man in the squad the opportunity to believe that they had fired the blank round and therefore had not actually killed their fellow soldier. Now, how much this really made a difference is hard to determine, as it was quite likely the men could tell the difference between a live round and a blank one when the rifle was fired. In most cases, after the volley had been fired, the sergeant in the squad would then pull out his pistol and put a bullet in the head of the condemned man. It was brutal and it was efficient. The men here in the area of the Ypres salient who were arrested for desertion were often taken to these prison cells here in Poppering. There are 2 of them that you can see to this day while they awaited their trial. When they were put on trial, it was in this building upstairs here in the town hall. If they were found guilty and if they were sentenced to death, and that death sentence was confirmed by the commander-in-chief, they were taken from this cell out into the courtyard where they were executed. It's an eerie thing. There's nobody here. There's just a door that you open and walk in on your own. There's nobody here like showing you around or keeping an eye on things. It's just here. We're going to look around at some of the things that they actually wrote on the walls in here. " 'The ' So we're now here in the courtyard, right next to the death cells, which were in this building right here. That's the cell right there. You can see it. And they have the post here. But I'm told by people who know these things that this is not the actual location where they were executed. They would have been executed out in the courtyard on the other side of this building. But we are very close to the spot where those executions took place. The men who were executed by the British during the war are buried in military cemeteries scattered all over Europe. But the largest collection of executed men in one place, by far, is here in Poppering. The Poppering New Military Cemetery was established in June of 1915. Prior to that, British and Commonwealth soldiers were buried in what is called the Old Military Cemetery here. This cemetery contains 677 Commonwealth burials of the First World War, as well as 271 French war graves on the other side. Now, walking among the graves, it's impossible to tell the difference between men who were killed by enemy fire, men who died of disease or accident, and the men who were executed by their own army. 17 of those who were executed in Poppering in 1916 and 1917 are buried here. So here in row F, we have a very unique concentration of the executed men who were shot at dawn over the span of a couple of weeks. We have Stedman here, who was executed on the 5th of September. Sergeant Wall was executed the next day on the 6th of September. Private Everill was executed on the 14th of September. And then just a young teenager, Morris, private from the British West Indies Regiment, was executed on the 20th of September. And I thought this was interesting. Somebody left a note here that says, "War is hell. He simply did what many would do. Rest in peace." Herbert Morris was 16 years old when he enlisted in Jamaica in December of 1916. He arrived in France in April 1917 as part of the 6th Battalion British West Indies Regiment. On August the 20th, he went missing from a work party here in the Ypres salient. He turned up the next day at a rest camp in Boulogne without his rifle, equipment, or a leave pass, so he was arrested. At his trial on the 7th of September, Morris, who was unrepresented by any defense, made an unsworn statement where he stated that he could not stand the sound of the guns and that the doctor that he had seen on the 19th of August gave him no satisfaction. Despite this defense, no medical examination was ordered, nor was a doctor called in to testify. Two of his officers gave evidence that Morris had never given any trouble and had worked willingly, but it further appeared that Morris had gone missing at least once before, back in July, and was given 2 weeks of field punishment for that offense before being sent back to the line. He was convicted of desertion and executed on the 20th of September 1917. He was just 17 years old. Eric Poole was born in Canada in 1885, but his family moved to England at some point before the war. In October 1914, he volunteered for the artillery. Eventually, he was given a commission in the infantry, and he came to the Western Front with the 11th Battalion, West Yorkshire Regiment. In the first week of July of 1916, while fighting at the Somme, he was nearly buried alive by the close impact of an artillery shell. And while he survived that impact, he came away with a severe case of what was then known as shell shock. He was medically evacuated from the line, but at the end of August, he was returned to the front in command of a platoon in C Company. On the 5th of October, he went AWOL as the battalion moved back to the frontline trenches. 2 days later, he was arrested and put on trial for desertion in the face of the enemy. His court-martial began in late November with 6 witnesses called to testify. One of them was a doctor who testified that Poole was in a psychological condition that had rendered him unfit to be placed in charge of a command at the time of his actions. He clearly had post-traumatic stress. It was shown that Poole was confused at the time he went AWOL and didn't seem to understand the seriousness of his actions. Even the officers in charge of the court-martial acknowledged that he appeared to have been suffering from a nervous collapse at the time of the offense. Now, despite that testimony, Poole was found guilty of desertion and sentenced to be shot. On December 3rd, a few days before his execution was set to take place, he was examined by an Army medical board, but the board concluded that he was, quote, of sound mind and capable of appreciating the nature of his actions, end quote. Poole's brigade, division, and corps commanders all recommended that his sentence be commuted. But Commander-in-Chief of the BEF, General Sir Douglas Haig, confirmed the verdict and sentence, and he noted in his diary that it was, quote, highly important that all ranks should realize that the law is the same for an officer as a private, end quote. On December 10th, Eric Poole became the first commissioned British officer to be shot at dawn during the Great War. Not all executed soldiers appear to have been suffering from shell shock. George Everill of the 1st Battalion North Staffordshire Regiment is one of those men. On separate occasions over a period of 18 months, he was convicted of using insubordinate language, of willful defiance, absence, and using threatening language. Following his punishment for the last offense, he was again convicted of willful defiance, for which he was serving field punishment when he was warned to be ready to move up for active operations. When his unit was mustered later in the day, he disappeared, leaving his rifle and equipment behind. He was found and arrested the next day. At his court-martial, he chose not to question even a single witness and made no statement in his own defense. He was shot at dawn on September 14th, 1917. Private Albert Troughton had fought bravely in his last action with the 1st Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers. But after he was notified of his brother's death, he wandered off for 3 hours and was arrested. He was tried for desertion and sentenced to be shot. On April 21st, 1915, he wrote a letter to his family that was smuggled out of his jail cell. Dear mother and father, sisters and brothers, just a few lines to let you know I am in the best of health and hope you are, Mother. I'm sorry to have to tell you that I am to be shot tomorrow at 7 o'clock in the morning, the 22nd of April. I hope you will take it in good part and not upset yourself. I shall die like a soldier. So goodbye, Mother, Father, sisters, and brothers, if any left. Remember me to Mr. Kendall and them who knew me. Mother, I'm very sorry nothing happened to me at Ypres. I should not have went away, and then I might have stood a good chance of being still alive. But I think that they are paying the debt at the full rate. I thought the most they would give me would be about 10 years. It is worse than waiting to be hung. I hope you got my letters which I sent you while waiting for my court-martial. It seems that something told me I would be shot, so I think the time has come for me to die. I am only a common soldier, and all civilians should know that I have fought for my country in hail, sleet, and snow. To the trenches we have to go. All my comrades have been slaughtered, which I think everyone should know. When our regiment was captured, the colonel loudly strained, "Everyone for himself." But on and on I fought and got clear of the German trenches. This is the punishment I get for getting clear of the Germans. I've written my last letter to you all at home. So, Mother, don't be angry with me, because I have gone to rest. And pray for me, and I will pray for you. Remember me to Mr. Newbold, and tell him about it. I've been silly to go away, but if you knew how worried I was, and almost off my head. Think how we had been slaughtered at the beginning of the war. You think they would have a bit of pity for those who are living for their country. Goodbye to all at home. Goodbye, goodbye. From your son, Albert.